Habakkuk is included in our lectionary only today, which I didn't know. So you will only hear that reading if the preacher is just following the lectionary readings. So I thought I would share a little bit about Habakkuk, taking a cue from Lori, who shared with you about Joel last week. So the book, it has only 3 short chapters, but as with all of the books in the Bible, it went through a rigorous testing through several hundred years before we have what we have today. So it's important to us. And we can also learn a great deal about God's desire toward us, God's intention toward us through Habakkuk. So what makes Habakkuk stand out? First I have to say, I've got to get it off my mind. Habakkuk just keeps making me think of Chewbacca and how he was Chewbacca at our Halloween party. And anyway, it was just making me laugh. So I just had to tell you about that. Habakkuk's nothing like Chewbacca. But it is an interesting name, isn't it? So what the prophets do is to tell of, usually, impending doom because people have turned away from God. But instead of declaring the catastrophe that will occur if the people do not make things right among them and between the people and God, Habakkuk has a conversation with God. He's lamenting the injustices that he sees all around him, that the corrupt and the selfish seem to prosper while the kind and the generous are exploited. And we see that all the time. And he feels like God doesn't seem to be watching or doing anything about it. And God replies to him. It's a conversation. God speaks to Habakkuk of God's promises, God's love and will for all to be made right. And this is where Habakkuk almost resembles a psalmist because he laments and then he lifts up his hands in praise. He praises God for the beauty and the joy in experiencing God's presence in faith and for the gift of faith that he has received from God. And in this conversation, because he has this conversation with God and God talks back. But in the case of this prophet, God responds and declares and reiterates the promises. And for the people who are in exile, the promise that the Babylonian captivity will come to an end, even in this time. And for them, that's what they hear. But for us, it's the same. We hear that God's promises are for the end, but in our time. And I love how Vanita Wright puts it. She says, everything in God's universe... Oh, are my slides not? Oh, you're so captivated by my story. This is my great-grandparents on my mom's side. Frederick and, do you remember her name? Greer has done all of this, like genealogy and anyway, Whip. And it was changed to Whip from Von Schripp. We think they're from Holland, Netherlands. Anyway, I just thought this was a perfect picture. I just received the picture, so I thought it was a good one for this. Everything in God's universe is present tense. Everything to God is present tense. Divine love transcends space and time. So God is beyond time and is always in the present. So in Habakkuk, when God says, for there is still a vision for the appointed time, it speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous live by their faith. So there are a couple of things in here that I want to focus on. So he says, there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end. So the appointed time that he's talking about, this vision, speaks to the end. And he says, wait, it will come, and it will not delay. So if it's not going to delay, then it should come quickly. But then he says, but wait. Wait, and it will not delay. The vision is for the end. It's for theirs and for ours, and at an appointed time. So there's a sense that God is already at that appointed time. Now, from whatever perspective it is, Habakkuk's or ours, that God can know it will occur and it will not delay, but if it seems to tarry, and it just, the way that God has to speak, God has to speak in the terms that we understand, but it doesn't make any sense because God is saying it's going to happen and it will happen like now, but it might tarry, so wait. And I think of this one epic time in life where this phenomenon is never more than real, at the time of giving birth. So during pregnancy, it seems as if the baby inside is never, ever going to come out, right? For those who understand, have given birth, you understand. And those who have ever been with somebody who's come close to that will probably understand this as well. Those last few days, if all is going really well with the baby and mama, of course, each day feels like an eternity. But when the baby comes, we wonder at how insignificant that time was by comparison to actually raising the kid. And then will they ever leave the house? Just kidding. I'm so grateful that my adult children are at my house right now. But time, it's so relative, right? But the reason for the delay of this all things being made right thing that God promises is what? Do you remember from the text? It's pride. Pride is what keeps things from being made right completely. Look at the proud. The spirit is not right in us, in them. That is, we're not living by faith. It's really clear. The pride, spirit's not right. They're not living by faith. Dwelling in the presence of God. Growing to become more of who God made us to be. The end, heaven on earth, all things right and good. It cannot happen when we have pride, when we think that there is something other than God who can fulfill us, who can make us more of who we are. If you remember from last week when I mentioned our discussion of the Enneagram and identity formation, what gives us identity? I read a quote, tragically, most of us start with our sense of identity, believing that if we build out the mythology of who we think we are, then the more attractive our identity and the more valuable we become. But when we start resting in the grace of our dignity, the worth, whose we are, who we are, then the truth of our identity is free to be exposed. We're not afraid to let people know who we are because it's in the image of God. I bear the image of God. You bear the image of God. I want to know what that means. I want to know you. If we're living into that, all things can be made right. The result of living out a mythology of self and without grace, the grace of dignity, the truth of who I am, who you are, as uniquely imaging God, the result of living for the myth and not living in the grace of knowing my worth. The result is shame. And a very wise person whom I know and is one of those adult children living in my space, we were talking about all of this, and she said, today's generation is dying to not feel ashamed. Literally and figuratively. Dying to not feel ashamed. And feel shamed by the church, because the church represents that presence of God. Ashamed of who they are. The church doesn't need to be inspiring. The church